The 1980s, a decade remembered for neon lights, synthesizer soundtracks, and the rise of the blockbuster. But beneath the glossy posters and big-budget popcorn hits, there was a darker side to cinema, a place where filmmakers tested the limits of what theaters, audiences, and even censors could endure. This wasn't just about jump scares or steamy love scenes. These were the films that shook the foundations of the moviegoing experience. The films that theater owners refused to play, or played only to packed houses of curious daredevils. The ones that sparked protests, police raids, and editorial outrage, all because they crossed invisible lines in the cultural sand. Some came from major studios and still shocked critics. Some were born in the grindhouse circuit, clawing their way into the public consciousness. And some were so extreme that theaters risked their reputations just to screen them. Before we dive in, if you love rediscovering the wild, untamed side of cinema history, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss our deep dives into the movies Hollywood would rather you forget. And if you enjoyed today's journey into the outrageous, give this video a like. It really helps keep these stories alive. This is Vintaverse, and today we're diving headfirst into 10 shocking 1980s movies that were too much for theaters. Number 10. RoboCop, 1987. When most people remember RoboCop, they think of a sharp, satirical action movie with a metal-clad hero delivering quotable one-liners. But back in 1987, before it became a cult classic and a merchandising juggernaut, RoboCop was a problem for theaters and an even bigger problem for the MPAA. The story, set in a dystopian Detroit overrun by corporate greed and violent crime, follows Officer Alex Murphy, murdered on duty and resurrected as the half-human, half-machine law enforcer known as RoboCop. On the surface, it's a futuristic cop drama, but Verhoeven's execution was brutally unflinching. The violence wasn't the stylized, bloodless fare of earlier action films. It was wet, visceral, and extended far beyond what audiences were used to seeing. The most infamous moment came early: Murphy's death scene. The original cut showed him being blown apart piece by piece in slow, agonizing detail. Test audiences recoiled. The MPAA slapped the film with an X rating, the same category used for pornography at the time, and refused to budge until the scene and several other moments were trimmed. Even after the cuts, the film still felt shockingly excessive for its R rating. But the controversy wasn't just about gore. Verhoeven laced RoboCop with savage satire, fake commercials, news reports, and corporate boardroom scenes that ridiculed consumer culture and desensitization to violence. Some theater owners worried that the mix of hyperviolence and biting social commentary would alienate audiences, especially in the politically charged late 80s. Number 9. Scarface, 1983. Few films capture the excess and brutality of the early 1980s like Scarface. On the surface, it's a rags-to-riches gangster saga, following Tony Montana, a Cuban immigrant who arrives in Miami with nothing and builds an empire out of pure ambition, brutality, and cocaine. But beneath the neon-drenched visuals and Giorgio Moroder's pulsating score, Scarface was a cinematic Molotov cocktail, and theaters knew it. By the time production wrapped, controversy was already brewing. The language was extreme, a record-shattering 226 uses of the F-word, which alone made some theater owners wary. But it wasn't just the profanity. The film was saturated with graphic violence, often unflinching in its detail. The infamous chainsaw scene in the motel was particularly troubling for the MPAA, who forced De Palma to submit the film multiple times to avoid an X rating. Even in its final form, the implication of what happens in that room was enough to shock audiences. Then there was the drug use. Never before had a mainstream Hollywood production shown cocaine culture so openly. The snorting, the paranoia, the empire built on powder. For the Reagan-era war on drugs, Scarface felt like a dangerous glorification of everything America was trying to fight. Anti-drug organizations protested outside some theaters, accusing the movie of glamorizing criminal lifestyles. And yet, Scarface pulled crowds. In cities like Miami, New York, and Los Angeles, screenings would sell out, attracting audiences who were as fascinated by Tony Montana's rise and fall as they were appalled by it. In smaller, more conservative markets, some theaters refused to book the film entirely, citing community standards, a polite way of saying Scarface was simply too much for their clientele. Number 8. Gremlins, 1984. On paper, Gremlins was the perfect holiday movie. Produced by Steven Spielberg, filled with cute furry creatures, set in a snow-covered small town at Christmas time, it had all the makings of a family hit. But as audiences quickly discovered, this was no harmless children's film. The premise is deceptively charming. A young man receives a mysterious pet called a mogwai, with 3 simple rules: no bright light, no water, and no feeding after midnight. Inevitably, those rules are broken, unleashing a horde of mischievous reptilian gremlins that terrorize the town. While that might sound like harmless slapstick, Joe Dante's direction leaned heavily into dark comedy and horror, catching parents completely off guard. The violence was shocking for a PG-rated film. Gremlins were blended, microwaved, stabbed, and set on fire. One even exploded in a kitchen blender in a sequence that mixed cartoonish glee with visceral splatter. Then there was the infamous story Kate tells about her father dying in a chimney dressed as Santa Claus, a moment so bleak it left audiences stunned. Parents complained. Reviewers debated whether Gremlins was appropriate for children at all. Theaters were suddenly faced with angry families demanding refunds, having walked in expecting something closer to E.T. and leaving in a state of mild trauma. In some communities, local newspapers ran editorials warning parents not to be fooled by the marketing. The backlash became so widespread that Gremlins, along with Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, released the same summer, led the MPAA to create the PG-13 rating. It was the industry's admission that some films fell into a gray area between light family fare and restricted adult content. Number 7. The Evil Dead, 1981. When The Evil Dead first hit screens in 1981, it wasn't backed by a major studio, didn't have Hollywood stars, and wasn't even made with a fraction of a blockbuster budget. It was a low-budget, independent horror film shot by a group of ambitious friends in the Tennessee woods. And yet, somehow, it became one of the most infamous and controversial releases of the decade. The plot is simple. 5 college friends vacation in a remote cabin where they discover a mysterious book, the Necronomicon, and accidentally unleash demonic forces. What follows is a relentless spiral of possession, mutilation, and supernatural horror. What made The Evil Dead stand out and what made theaters so cautious was its sheer intensity. Raimi's camera work was hyperkinetic, swinging and rushing through the forest like an unseen predator. The violence was creative, relentless, and grotesque. And it wasn't just blood, it was the atmosphere. The film oozed dread, with a gritty, almost too real quality that made even seasoned horror fans squirm. In the UK, it became a key target of the infamous video nasty moral panic. The British Board of Film Classification demanded cuts, and in some regions, police actually raided video stores to seize copies. Even in the US, where the First Amendment offered some protection, small-town theaters hesitated to book it, fearing community backlash. But controversy can be a strange kind of marketing. The Evil Dead got a boost from none other than Stephen King, who called it the most ferociously original horror film of the year. Number 6. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Some films disturb you while you watch them, others haunt you long after the credits roll. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer did both, and it scared theaters for reasons that went far beyond blood and gore. Inspired loosely by real-life killer Henry Lee Lucas, the film follows Henry and his unstable roommate Otis
as they drift through Chicago, leaving a trail of victims behind. What makes Henry so unsettling is its cold, observational style. There's no dramatic music to cue fear, no exaggerated performances to distance the audience from the horror. It feels like you're watching reality unfold, and that made it dangerous. When McNaughton submitted the film to the MPAA, they refused to give it an R rating, not because of one specific scene, but because the overall tone was deemed too disturbing. The message was clear: no amount of cuts could make it acceptable for mainstream audiences. Without an R rating, most theaters refused to touch it, since an unrated film was box office poison in 1986. Those that did play Henry often faced protests. One infamous scene, a home invasion sequence captured on a handheld camcorder, became the center of outrage. It wasn't just the violence, it was the way it was presented, with a detached, matter-of-fact cruelty that made it feel uncomfortably plausible. Despite, or perhaps because of the controversy, the film earned critical acclaim from some corners. Roger Ebert praised it for avoiding exploitation while confronting the audience with the banality of evil. But critical support didn't change the fact that for many theaters, showing Henry meant risking their reputation.
Number 5. Maniac, 1980. Before the 80s slasher boom really found its formula, Maniac arrived like a blunt weapon to the head. Grimy, claustrophobic, and unapologetically disturbing. Released in 1980, it followed Frank Zito, a lonely and deeply unstable man wandering the streets of New York City, leaving a trail of violence in his wake. This was no sleek, studio-produced horror film. Maniac looked and felt like the city it portrayed: dirty, dangerous, and on the edge of collapse. The budget was small, the lighting was harsh, and the performances were unsettlingly real, especially from Joe Spinell, who also co-wrote the film. Spinell's portrayal of Zito wasn't cartoonish or over the top. It was sweaty, mumbled, and scarily believable. That realism was exactly what made audiences and theater owners so uneasy. When Maniac opened, it was met with immediate backlash. Critics attacked it as sick and depraved, and in some cities, posters for the film were vandalized. In certain counties, local councils outright banned it. In the US, while it avoided an X rating, many theaters chose not to screen it at all, worried about the reputational damage of showing something so intense. What made Maniac truly controversial wasn't just the violence, it was the tone. This wasn't a horror movie with cathartic jump scares or ironic humor. It was slow, oppressive, and unrelenting, forcing the audience to sit uncomfortably close to its damaged central character. And unlike the more polished slashers that would dominate the decade, Maniac refused to offer moral distance. Number 4. Threads, 1984. While most films on this list shocked with gore, violence, or scandalous subject matter, Threads horrified audiences in a completely different way by making them believe the end of the world was not only possible, but inevitable. Produced by the BBC and first broadcast on British television in 1984, Threads wasn't originally intended for theatrical release, but its impact was so seismic that some theaters later screened it and discovered that this quiet documentary-style drama could leave audiences more shaken than the most graphic horror films. The premise was simple but devastating. An escalating conflict between the US and the Soviet Union leads to nuclear war, and the film follows the people of Sheffield, England before, during, and after the attack. What set Threads apart was its unflinching realism. There were no heroic last stands, no last-minute rescues, no melodramatic speeches, just the slow, methodical destruction of society and the grim aftermath that spanned decades. In theaters, Threads caused walkouts. Some audience members reportedly vomited. Others left in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just seen. In the US, where it was aired on HBO, it gained a reputation as the most disturbing film ever made about nuclear war, even surpassing The Day After in its bleakness. Theaters that dared to show it often warned patrons in advance, and some critics argued that it should have come with a psychological advisory. Number 3. The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. Few films of the 1980s sparked as much global outrage as Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. Based on the novel by Nikos Kazantzakis, it told the story of Jesus Christ, but with a twist that many religious groups found unacceptable: the portrayal of a human, conflicted Jesus who experiences doubt, fear, and temptation, including a controversial vision of what his life might have been had he not been crucified. From the moment production was announced, protests began. In the US, major Christian organizations called for boycotts. In other countries, including Greece and Chile, the film was outright banned. Theaters that planned to screen it received threatening letters. And in France, one cinema was even firebombed by extremists. What made The Last Temptation so contentious wasn't graphic content. It had very little in the way of violence or nudity by Hollywood standards, but the suggestion of imperfection in a religious figure millions hold sacred. For many, this was not just a movie. It was a perceived act of blasphemy. For theater owners, the decision to show it became a litmus test. Some stood by the principle of free expression. Others decided it wasn't worth the risk, financially or physically. In more conservative US towns, screenings were canceled after community leaders intervened, citing fears of unrest. Yet the controversy didn't sink it. In fact, it fueled curiosity. Lines formed outside theaters in cities like New York and Los Angeles, where the protests themselves became part of the spectacle. And despite the uproar, the film went on to receive an Academy Award nomination for Best Director. Number 2. A Clockwork Orange, US theatrical re-release, 1980s. Although A Clockwork Orange was originally released in 1971, its reputation loomed so large that when it returned to select US theaters in the early 1980s, it felt like a brand new provocation. Kubrick's dystopian nightmare about a young gang leader named Alex who revels in ultra-violence before being subjected to a psychological reprogramming experiment was already infamous for its brutal imagery, sexual violence, and morally ambiguous tone. The re-release was met with two extremes: intense anticipation from cinephiles and outright refusal from some theaters to show it at all. In the UK, Kubrick himself had pulled the film from circulation in 1973 after copycat crimes were allegedly linked to its influence, meaning the only way many British fans could see it in the 80s was through illicit bootlegs or rare foreign screenings. In the US, its 1980s theatrical return coincided with a cultural climate more sensitive to media violence than ever before. Religious groups and parent organizations held protests outside cinemas, arguing that the film glorified brutality and degraded moral standards. Meanwhile, critics hailed its artistry, praising Kubrick's ability to blend shocking content with biting social commentary. For theaters, booking A Clockwork Orange was a gamble. On one hand, it was a critically acclaimed masterpiece by a legendary director. On the other, it was a magnet for controversy and potential public backlash. Number 1. I Spit on Your Grave, 1980. If there was one film in the 1980s that became the ultimate litmus test for censorship boards, critics, and theaters alike, it was I Spit on Your Grave. Originally released in 1978 under the title Day of the Woman, the film found a much wider and more controversial audience when it was re-released in 1980, right in the middle of the decade's rising moral panic over video nasties and exploitation cinema. The plot follows Jennifer Hills, a young writer who rents a cabin to work on her novel, only to endure a horrific attack that leads to her exacting violent revenge on her assailants. Even more than its violence, what made this film so contentious was the tone. It wasn't stylized like Kill Bill, nor was it paced like a traditional slasher. Instead, it lingered on its most disturbing moments in a way that critics accused of being exploitative. Roger Ebert famously gave it 0 stars, calling it a vile bag of garbage. And in the UK, it was banned outright, landing a prominent spot on the Video Nasties list. In the US, some theaters refused to play it at all, while others found themselves swamped with both protesters and curious patrons. Police in some areas even seized prints from projection booths. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of the backlash, the movie developed a cult following. For some horror fans, seeing it was almost like joining a secret club, proof you could handle the most shocking film out there. For others, it was simply indefensible. Either way, theaters knew that showing I Spit on Your Grave meant you weren't just running a movie, you were hosting a cultural flashpoint. Today, it remains one of the most divisive films ever made, still sparking debates about censorship, artistic intent, and the line between horror and exploitation. But in 1980, it was the ultimate Too Far, a movie so controversial that even its title became shorthand for taboo cinema. If you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us, a true explorer of cinema's wild side. So before you go, hit that subscribe button to join the Vintaverse community, where we dive deep into the stories Hollywood doesn't want you to forget. And if you enjoyed this trip into controversy, give this video a like. It helps us bring you even more untold movie history. Until next time, keep your popcorn close and your mind open.